So, welcome to this special episode of the Waters and Harvey Show. We want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. Marcus, this is the first time we're doing this live. I don't know how you
Yeah,
feel, but there's a little bit of extra anxiety that's going with this tonight.
yeah, just a little bit, but I think this has been a long time coming. I think the show has been headed in this direction for some time, so it's exciting to finally be here.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment to thank everyone, those who are in the audience tonight for this. We've gotten feedback from a number of you. We want to thank you for being here tonight and also thank you for being a part of regular listeners to the Waters and Harvey show. And thank you for being a part of the show. We also want to take the time, Marcus, to thank Blue Ridge Public Radio because they create these forums where we can kind of come together to have great conversations. And when I think about the fact why you and I started the show, it was about being able to come together to have conversations about things that we thought were that people we knew from conversations that we're not only having with students, but with people in the community that people felt were important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we it seems as if we live in a society where there is not an abundance of spaces where folks can sort of come together and have serious, critical, civil conversations about what's going on in the broader society and how what is going on in the broader society is impacting them individually and also their community. So I think what we've created here is one such space, right, where
Mhm.
folks can come together, you and I can come together and sort of have some of these conversations.
Right. And one thing I want to say here tonight, I've got to take the moment, take a rib at you, brother, because most people don't get to see us really on camera. We're usually just in the studio. Now with
Yeah.
COVID, we're in our home offices where we're doing this via Zoom. But, for those of you who are in the audience, what you don't see most of the time is that Marcus is always trying to find a way to throw me off my game. Now, he has promised because this is being videotaped tonight that we're live, that he's not going to do that to me. So, brother, I'm going to hold you to that. All
Well,
right.
I appreciate it, but you do have one coming, so look
Right.
out.
Okay. Well, one thing I want to say too, Marcus, as we think about the conversations that we've been having, one of the larger topics that we have been focusing on has been the issue of memory and its influence on history. So it's interesting as I think about that because we received a note from one of our listeners, John Ross, and I want to reference it here because he caught one of the last shows that we did. I think it was the show that we did with Dr. Daniel Pierce, talking about what was going on with the this effort to try to uncover the history of African Americans who helped to build and construct the Western North Carolina Railroad. And he actually said that I caught a bit of your show on memory and its influence on history, and he said it was absolutely fascinating. But he said the problem is that we can't remember what we don't know. And so again, Marcus, that reminded me again of why it is so important that we have created this show to talk about things that we don't necessarily know. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of people saying, we didn't know these things that you all are talking about. We appreciate you bringing them to our attention.
Yeah, and I think this whole question of our relationship to the past is really in memory, historical memory, is really an important question because I think that if we are to gain an accurate understanding of the present. And also chart a workable course or workable path forward into the future. We have to have the courage
Mm,
as a community, as a state, as a nation, to really interrogate our relationship with the past, right?
mhm.
What is the nature of that relationship? Is it a healthy relationship? Is it an educated relationship? Is it a formative relationship? Is it a dysfunctional relationship?
Right, right.
And if it is dysfunctional, why is that the case? What can be done to address that? So again, I mean, I think this ongoing conversation about historical memory and about how the past relates to the present is absolutely essential
It is.
in a democratically organized society that cares about the future
Right, right.
of that society or of
So I,
itself, I should say.
yeah. So Marcus, I think you bringing up that is a great segue into our topic tonight: civic engagement. What is civic engagement, and why is it important? And so we have a great panel with us tonight, a group of people who I consider friends and colleagues who agreed to kind of come together to discuss this issue of civic engagement. And before we turn to the first two panelists, what I want to do is we got a note from Hunter Horn, who is the head of the Wild Acres Leadership Initiative, the William Friday Fellowship, a good friend and colleague. And his comment that came in, I thought was very interesting because he said, to me, civic engagement means both inquiry and action into all spheres of life. This applies not only to what may be traditionally understood as governmental or public spaces, but also to interpersonal relationships, even to neighbors, which is something that you and I've talked about. But what's important, what really caught my eye is that he quoted Ella Baker, major civil rights leader, and he said that Ella Baker said in a rally in 1974, quote, "A nice gathering like this today is not enough. You have to go back and reach out to your neighbors who you don't speak to," end quote. And I think that's fundamentally important. So we've invited Dr. William Turner, who many of our listeners know because they've heard him on the show before, and Miss Tracy Green Washington, who people in this community are going to know, who's been in the philanthropic world, to kind of join us in this conversation about civic engagement. And what we'd like to do is ask Dr. Turner to give us some historical perspective, because he was directly involved with the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. And I'd like to hear from him, what does civic engagement look like then, and how has it changed? And then to hear from Tracy about the larger issue of civic engagement beyond just the political, but talking about what's going on in the world of philanthropy. So Bill, welcome to the show. Tracy, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you both.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Well, I want to thank you all for inviting me on again, and I'm glad to see you guys. I haven't been to Asheville in a year and a half, although we talk a lot, and it's just good to see you. I hope that my turf of white hair doesn't give me away in terms of the fact I'm 75 years old. So I ain't no spring chicken. And in that sense, my life has been framed by, the civil rights movement. I haven't been born at the end of the Second World War. But I also want to very quickly go to the point of my background. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and when doing what you might call the days of rigid segregation. I'm sure you had such a thing like that in Asheville too. My daddy was a coal miner. We went to a so-called segregated colored school, like the one you had there in Asheville, Darren. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of it, but I think Al Whitesides went to school there.
That's right, Stevens Lee.
Right, Al and I are the same age, so we had the same background. So my father was an ardent trade unionist. My father belonged to the United Mine Workers of America, and that was a very strong labor movement in the 1930s and 40s. But also in our hometown, like in the Asheville's Black community, I was surrounded by people for whom civic engagement was a way of life, because even when you were in school, you were required almost to be in some play, some operetta. There was a Corte Calente, there was the Eastern Star, there were the Prince Hall Masons, there were the Elks, there were the Sunday school church meetings, the Boy Scout things, the Girl Scout things that we were doing. So there was virtually no distractions like you have nowadays. You had to get involved in something because it was a dynamic little community, and we had this kind of consciousness of kind, and we had a sense of a common destiny. And also too, we had these preachers and these teachers who kept us all on track, so that we literally grew up. And by the time Martin Luther King and Ella Baker, of course, being involved as she was with the founding of SNCC, by the time I arrived to that in 1965, and I was 19 years old, to be involved seemed quite natural. You dared not be involved because that's what everybody was doing. It was in our music, it permeated the entire culture. So that's the framework I would start with in terms of memory. In my life, the way a fishing line or fly line has a memory to it. And I haven't managed to get away from that memory in 75 years.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that perspective. And I do want to say here, because I didn't say it before Tracy jumps in, that your autobiography is going to be coming out really soon. And so just for our audience, just to let them know, they'll be able to get that book, which is titled A Harlan Renaissance, Growing Up in Harlan, Kentucky. So, Bill, we're really looking forward to that.
Well, I am too, in a way. You know, it takes a little hubris and a little a sprinkle of arrogance to think somebody might want to read about your life anyway. So it's really not about me as much as I would like to think it's a group biography, because I passed around amongst 20 good friends that I grew up with, some of whom are 15 years older than I am. I worked over this over the last 8 or 9 years. So yeah, it'll come out from West Virginia University Press, and it's called the Harlan, Harlan, but it's also a kind of takeoff on the Harlem Renaissance. In the period in the 20s when Harlem was the epicenter of Black life and culture in America, that place I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, in what we call the very heart of Appalachia. Harlan, Kentucky was what we used to call the blackest town for mountains around. And I didn't see a lot of white people until I went to college. You know, I mean, I literally called my daddy when I got to college and said, "Oh, Lord, Dad, I didn't know there was this many white people in the world." I'm very serious, because we grew up in this insular little community, and it was just a fascinating place. But because it was so tied to one industry, coal mining, as that became mechanized, the first people that were let go were the Black people. So in the town where I was born in the mid 40s, where there were 14,000 people, well, right now there are probably more people in a dormitory there at UNCA than live in my hometown. I think it's about 500 people live in town now. So
wow.
yeah, I'm looking forward to my book coming out, and I'll be over to Asheville and see you guys with it.
Okay, well, Tracy, we want to turn to you as well. Tracy, very accomplished in the philanthropic world, also an author. And Tracy, I want to let everybody know the title of your book, if they don't know, and you can get it. Her book is called Choosing Purposeful Alignment, The Messy Middle of Transformation. And so, Tracy, we want to hear from you a little bit about your perspective about civic engagement, especially as you look at it from the perspective of the philanthropic world.
Thank you for that, Darren. And I'm so excited to be here with everyone. Dr. Turner, thank you for weaving together like this beautiful history. You know, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about my experience of when I first engaged around community organizing with the NAACP and Elder Hayes. And so those memories just kind of hearkened and came back to me. And there was a couple of things that came up for me too, Dr. Turner, as you were talking and really talking about civic engagement, is the fact that it was not static, like it's dynamic, right? The very nature of engagement is that it is ever changing, but it has to be intentional. And I love that you lifted that up, that it is about relationships, right? It's very relational, right? You can't be in and advocating for issues if you don't trust each other or have a connection. And what I love about it too, Dr. Turner, when you talked about that it activated something, right? And it wasn't about addressing really soft issues. It was really about addressing those entrenched, hard, messy issues. But what it also lifted up for me too, the very nature of putting civic in terms of engagement, it raises the question of who is left out. And that's particularly relevant as we think about today's context and what we are supporting, what we are seeing from a multi-generational perspective in terms of the movements that are happening and that we're seeing unfold across, globally, right? So for me, when I thought about civic engagement, there are a couple of questions that came up for me as well. And it wasn't exactly about what it meant, but what was required, right? And so what is required for civic engagement to really be impactful is that it's proximity. We have to be willing to get close to each other. We have to be willing to get close to the issues and unpack them, right? We can't be scared of them, and we can't be scared of discomfort. We have to understand and get close to the people who are directly impacted and center them in a way that allows them to be able to move into the space and to really facilitate the solutions to the problems that are facing our communities. It also requires us to have healthy, equitable, and positive relationships, right? Those are relationships where we don't villainize each other, that we are there to work together in service to a shared line of sight, and being clear that we won't let the mess, the muck get in the way of us getting there. And I think the other thing that comes up for me is that it requires us to have an equity lens, and in particular a racial equity lens, because when we look at the data and we disaggregate it along racial lines, The folks that are most impacted by the issues and and that community engagement is meant to facilitate, activate, and address are people of color, right? They are Black, Indigenous, people of color, however you self-identify as African American and Latinx. From a gender perspective, talking about the LGBTQ community, and on and on and on. And I think the last thing that comes up to me, and I'm going to talk about the role of philanthropy relative to civic engagement, is that it requires courageous conversations. And I'm not talking about the polite conversations. I'm talking about the meaty conversations where we are holding each other accountable and are holding each other accountable in a way that we relearn, unlearn, and think about how we move into these spaces in an intentional way as allies, as partners, but also as provocateurs and disruptors as we move forward. And so as I think about the role of philanthropy in facilitating social change, I actually think that they can play and have played a critical role in that. And they have the ability, particularly if it's strategic philanthropy. Now, there's a difference between traditional philanthropy that has this more charity-oriented mindset than those that are strategic philanthropic organizations. What I've observed over the course of my career is when they are strategic, they understand that place matters. The context of where you do this work, where you engage, is important. They understand the role of equity and inclusion. They understand that although they may lead with their financial capital, that they have to use other tools in their arsenal beyond financial capital. They have social capital in thinking about the relationships they build. Intellectual property capital in terms of the research that they're able to put out and do it from an equitable place. You know, they have relational capital, and it goes on and on and on, and they need to activate that as they move forward. And so as I think about the work in terms of that's complementary to that, I can't help but lift up CoThink's work, because CoThink's work is all about social change philanthropy, which is complementary to strategic philanthropy, but it's very different. It's from the very beginning, it is about engaging those and centering those that are most impacted by the work and seeing those individuals as the drivers to be able to come up with the solutions by focusing on their time, talent, and treasure. It is explicit about equity unapologetically. And it is specific about ways that are counterculture to dominant culture that really work for our community. When I think about the work of CoThink in Western North Carolina, one of the things that I think was very powerful in our work is from the very beginning, it was collective, it was about building consensus, and it was strategic, and it was intentional. We knew that if we were going to be successful, that we had to focus on 4 strategic levers. Healing, that many people don't want to talk about, that has to be centered in our work. Capacity building, thinking about how we build the capacity of others as well as ourselves to show up in space, to be able to be disruptors, positive disruptors in changing systems and structures. Also thinking about access to resources and making sure that those individuals that can drive the change actually have the resources to be able to do it. And in thinking about resources, not just in a traditional ways in terms of grants, but capacity building in terms of coaching, self-care stipends, and really figuring out what that means for us in community. And I want to say the last pillar that we focused on is really talking about structural change. Because the reality is you can do all this work, but if you don't change the systems, if you don't change the structures, then there's no way you can facilitate and sustain transformational change in our community. So as I think about the role of civic engagement, what I will say is that in philanthropy, that there are critical levers that we all can deploy. But we have to make sure those that are most impacted, directly impacted, are coming up with the solutions and are the drivers of change. If we don't do that, then we are perpetuating an endless cycle of structures and systems that we said that we wanted to interrupt. It is our responsibility to figure out what those appropriate levers are as we move forward.
Tracy, you've hit on a number of points, and And Dr. Turner, I see response in your face. Is there something that you want to respond to that Tracy has said? And Tracy, I do want one thing I want us to put a pin in as we get to a question and answer section is what you said about the need for these relationships, for relationship is so key and important to this. And I wonder how well are we doing in building those relationships is something that Marcus and I have talked a lot about. But Dr. Turner, let me just turn it over to you here.
First, I want to mention and commend you. Go to a website. It's called snicdigital.org. And you talking about a wealth of information on the way SNCC people operated, particularly in terms of relationships, personal relationships that people had that went from Kentucky, where I was, to Gee's Bend, Alabama, to Greenwood, Mississippi, and back to Greensboro, North Carolina. And so that we all actually knew each other very well. We had some very personal relationships. I was sitting once, Darren, with your mentor, John Hope Franklin, he and Sierra Lincoln, and they were talking about how in those days, every Black PhD in the United States knew each other. You know, it's like, hey, man, we all knew each other because when we went to Nashville, we couldn't stay in the hotels. We stayed in each other's homes. And so now there are Black PhDs down the street from me that I don't know because we don't have those kind of relationships anymore. So, you know, when we talk about SNCC, which meant so much to me in terms of being in an organization like that, because SNCC was pretty decentralized also. I mean, you know, much like we see with the Black Lives Movement today, it's a very decentralized movement. And while it came out of the church organization, SNCC was also got to be known as the most militant, if you will, of those organizations at that time. You may recall, for example, out of SNCC became the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party with Fannie Lou Hamer and the Black Panther Party, and later the All African People's Revolutionary Party. People talking about democratic socialism, which the senator in Vermont, you know, we know how that goes. So the March on Washington, the freedom, we did a lot of direct action. And so nowadays, when I see the difference, nowadays it seems to me people are much more likely to respond to specific incidences like Breonna Taylor's murder or the murder of George Floyd. Whereas in those days, we were involved in things every week, every day. We did not wait until somebody was suffocated, you know. So there was a much more active and intentional movement because we had some very specific goals that had to do with public values that we were all about. Nowadays, it's much different than that. And I sometimes wonder what is the impact of the other side of it is there was a great problem in the 60s at one point with SNCC and its white membership, because there was always a question of whether the white kids that came from the North into the South were going to try to, quote, take over the movement. And that became a real struggle. But we do remember, even in my home county last summer, after George Floyd, the vast majority of the people out marching were young white kids. So I saw a lot of multiracial involvement since George Floyd. And I live here in Houston, and it was unbelievable the kinds of things that were going on here in town with multiracial people, multi-ethnic groups, people getting together, being pulled together by the George Floyd murder. So, and plus, of course, I think it's going to change in the role of the Black church. It's an interesting phenomenon between the fact that in the Black Lives Movement, there is a strong base in the LGBT community, and that runs counter to some things in the very conservative elements of the Black church.
Yeah. Dr. Turner, I love that you talked about this notion of these movements in some ways being reactive. I actually share a different perspective that I think is complementary to what you're lifting up. I actually think that these movements have been readying themselves and they have been positioning themselves for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think I think what's really beautiful about it is that they're movements within movements, right? It's not just one movement. There are multiple movements that are ready to be activated. And I think that they have been just getting ready for the right moment. And as a result of being ready in that right moment, they're able to activate it in a way that's very powerful. I do think, as I think about the role of philanthropy, that I think is a challenge is that oftentimes when philanthropy supports civic engagement, they support it around an issue, action, or a particular moment in time. And what we need and continuously need as these movements are being seeded is that we need ongoing support that is multi-year, that allows for innovation in this space to be strategic. When I think about what happened in Georgia with Latasha and Stacey Abrams, that was the result of multiple years of organizations and communities getting ready. Even when I think about the emergence of Co-Think as a social change philanthropy in Asheville, it was the result of multiple issues, multiple conversations that have been happening for many, many years, starting with at UNCA, Darren and others talking about the data relative to racial equity, right? And then talking about the role that the city could play and the county could play. Then building the capacity of leaders and other institutions to be able to talk about racial equity and be able to think about what is their role, what ways they are complicit, and what role they need to play in being able to activate change in a community. There's no way that Co-Think could be able to move into our community in a way that it has been without the work that had been seeded for many, many years prior to us being able to activate this new lever to move this work forward. And so I think it's this really secret sauce, this gumbo, but I think it is a balance between this readiness, right? And waiting for that right opportunity to be able to unleash it, to move it forward in a way that really is sustainable and is not a moment in time. It really is about transformational and structural change.
Well, thank you, Dr. Turner and Tracy, for those insights surrounding the historical and philanthropic dimensions of civic engagement. I think your comments enable us to segue nicely into the political dimensions of civic engagement, right? As a kind of practice, right? So we can talk about civic engagement also as a political practice, right? As well as being a historically related practice in a philanthropic practice. But as we all know, our current political climate of late over the past several years has been quite contentious, to say the least. And, there are questions now, I think, about what the sort of present contentious nature of our political climate has had or may be having on the attitudes of Americans around the whole question of civic engagement. And so here to help us think about that, are Doctors Chris Cooper and Ashley Miraguez. A quick note on these two panels. Dr. Cooper is the Robert Lee Madison Distinguished Professor and Department Head of Political Science and Public Affairs at Western Carolina University. He's also the co-author of a book entitled The Resilience of Southern Identity, Why the South Still Matters in the Minds of Its People, and the co-editor of The New Politics of North Carolina. Dr. Miraguez is an assistant professor of political science at UNC Asheville, where I teach, with teaching specialties and interest in American political institutions. So why don't we start with Dr. Cooper first? Thoughts about this whole question around the contentious nature of our political climate currently, and whether or not you see this as having an impact on how people think about political engagement, how they engage the question of political engagement, and really on their, perhaps on their interest or their enthusiasm around public engagement in this way.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks so much for having us. It's an intimidating panel to be on, but I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to continue this conversation. Super glad to be on with Ashley too, one of my favorite political scientists. But I think maybe I'll, at the running the risk of changing the terms ever so slightly, I might push us to think a little bit about the term political engagement instead of civic engagement, which is not to say I don't think civic engagement is important. I do, of course. But I think sometimes we've been too quick to let the word political become a pejorative, right? So if I say I'm going to have a political conversation, everybody sort of backs up. And I don't really want to have that now. But I think we need to remember that politics is the way in which we should peacefully be trying to get to resolution. So I want us just to maybe think a little bit about, not moving away from the term civic. I don't mean that at all, but just reminding ourselves that it can be political and civic at the same time, and that political isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then finally, on that point, that political doesn't necessarily mean governmental. So there's a political scientist who says something basically like politics is about who gets what, when, where, and how. And if you think about politics in that way, it's this really broadening way of thinking about it, right? It's not just about what Congress does, whether it needs 2/3 vote. It's about how we get the things that we're after. Those don't have to be goods, right? Those can be ideas. Those can be freedoms. Those can be ideals. That can be freedom. It can be whatever the thing is that we're after. So I think just kind of thinking that through a little bit, trying to sort of rescue the notion of political. At the same time, when I say political, I don't mean scrolling Twitter. I don't mean complaining to your friends at the bar about politics, although that can be fun in a non-COVID world. But what I mean is using politics to achieve an end. So there's a book I like a lot that I think we talked about when I was in your show before, called Politics is for Power, by a political scientist named Eaton Hirsch. And his argument is that we've started to spend too much time thinking about political hobbyism, right? So the notion that, like, if you're on Twitter and you get the sick burn on whoever you're after, that is somehow political engagement. But that's really not doing anything else other than maybe temporarily making yourself feel better, right? So he's saying, hey, we need to remember that politics is for power. And that's a good thing again. Politics is about action. Politics is about trying to get an end, not to exact some rhetorical revenge on your ally. And I think this actually plays nicely with the last panel. I think Tracy said, Tracy Green Washington said, we need to have courageous conversations, sort of made a note of that. I thought that was a better way to say it than I could ever come up with. And she also talked about changing structures that leads to transformational change. And again, I think this is all kind of the same idea, right? That it's not about nasty rhetoric. It's about using politics, having courageous conversations, and changing the structures that get us there. So I'll sort of take a pause there and let Ashley kind of hop at it for a while.
Yeah, Ashley. So we'll turn to you now. Thoughts on this question of the political parameters, political in the sense that Dr. Cooper has just outlined, of civic engagement. So we're happy to turn to you.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the other panelists for setting me up to fill such big shoes here. And it's great to be here with my colleagues from UNCA and from Western Carolina. I've thought a lot about engagement in this particular political climate. I started teaching political science right before the Trump presidency. And so my whole kind of career to this point has been in this very contentious period. And I really have thought, I always tell my students that engagement is more than voting. And I think everything is political, like, interpersonal relationships are political as well. And so I'm very sympathetic to Dr. Cooper's point there about, talking about political engagement. But thinking about political engagement in this particular contentious period of time, I think is really interesting, because there is some research out there that says that people are more engaged than ever. And this is really when they say that they're talking about voting in some ways, especially the 2020 election where we had really high turnout. And we also find that the motivation here is something called negative partisanship, which has been getting a lot of traction. So Alan Abramowitz and Stephen Webster, two political scientists, have talked about this a lot, that what's motivating people now, which is different than in the past, is not an affinity towards our party or like-minded individuals or issues we care about, but it's animosity towards the other side. And that this has really taken off in the past 5 to 10 years, maybe, and especially more recently that we've seen this. And I think that's absolutely true when it comes to the issue of voting. I'm not sure that I think it's true for all types of civic engagement or political engagement, because I think there's so much more to it than just voting. And I really think it's a more consistent and it's more of an investment in political activity when we're talking about political engagement. It's not just showing up to the polls every 2 or 4 years to cast your vote, though that is a very important part of civic engagement, one that I encourage. And so what I've been thinking a lot about is, what's getting people to engage or not engage in ways other than voting right now. And I think it's really an issue of trust at the end of the day. We have record low levels of historic trust in the past 10 years. Pew has been doing research, and I think in late 2020, 20% of the public said that they trust the government right now and only trust other people in their community at like a percent of 30, I think it was. So really low levels of trust. And so I've been thinking like, well, what's going on? Why aren't people trusting government or their neighbors as much? And I actually want to lay the blame at least partially on our politicians. I'm going to pander to Darren here a little bit and talk about Tocqueville very briefly, and then I can throw it back to the rest of the panel. But Tocqueville thought the big strength of American politics was the fact that, we had this vibrant social state or civil society where people were super engaged, and we had these free institutions that people could engage in really easily. And that's what strengthened our democratic institutions. And I want to make the argument, and I'm sure Chris will be sympathetic to this, that our politicians, because they're self-interested and want to keep their jobs and keep their power, they design institutions to make it harder for us to engage with the process. This is true in voting. This is true in almost every political aspect. And so one of the problems here isn't necessarily an individual responsibility, though that exists, but it's just navigating the system that was designed to be really hard for us to navigate. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to go in more detail, but I can kick it back to everyone.
Right. Well, Ashley, I appreciate the fact that you were the first one to bring up Alexis de Tocqueville and not me, because Marcus and Chris would have really made hay of that if I had been the first one to say it. But, Ashley and Chris, to get you both to kind of respond to this, I appreciate the perspectives that you have offered. And Chris, I do have to take one dig at you in talking about changing the language here from civic to political. It explains why you have just a small circle of friends when you're trying to change this language. No, I'm just kidding, Kirk. I had to take that dig. Right. But here's what I would ask you, and you've alluded to this, Ashley. I was on a panel with you not too long ago where you talked brilliantly about the Constitution. Chris, you and I have talked about the Constitution. Me and you, in a conversation that Marcus and I had with you, we talked about the Constitution, especially the state's Constitution, which is very hard to understand. So, I'm wondering, Ashley and Chris, if there's somewhat of a decline in political engagement, and we'll use that language, Chris, I think you're right to try to change the way we see that. If there's somewhat of a decline, or this distrust in the political process, is that in any way linked to a lack of real good civics education about how our institutions actually function? We have been watching lately this process that is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. And it just strikes me that many people are really confused when they see how Congress itself actually functions. Do we really understand how our government, especially the legislative branch of government, functions? And is that something that we need to kind of tend to?
Guess I'll hop in. Yes. Can I just say yes? I do think we need to pay more attention to that. And I don't just say that as a full employment plan for Ashley and I. I think we need to do a better job teaching civics. There's a kind of a fun article from a few years ago that says we should be teaching barbarics instead of civics. And their point was an interesting one, right? Essentially, they're arguing that when we teach this, how a bill becomes a law, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill version of politics, that people then get surprised, right? And they say, wow, it isn't that clean. It is kind of messy. And sometimes these people say bad things about each other. And so we're sort of the gap between what we expect out of government and what we get out of government grows because of the ways in which we teach these things. So yes, I think we need to rethink how we teach politics. And I also think we need to spend more, you sort of mentioned briefly, Darren, and thanks, the sort of state constitution. And I think spending more time thinking about the state and local levels, spending more time thinking about questions about how we're governed a little bit closer to home would be more than welcome. I think most folks aren't even really aware that there's state constitutions in addition to a federal constitution. Getting students, even in college, to think through what's going on in Raleigh versus what's going on in Washington. And those are separate things with separate rules. So absolutely, I think more education could help combat some of this and might rescue congressional approval, which right now I believe is below cockroaches and the band Nickelback, which is to say low.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Chris. And I'm thinking, Dr. Moraguez, about your point around how there just seems to be a distrust, right, in the political process. I'm thinking also about the very important and astute point you made about how our democratic system of governance has been designed. It seems that it's been designed or engineered to make it harder to participate. And so Darren knows that as far as he and I are concerned, I tend to veer more in the direction of pessimism when it comes to America's political future, whereas he tends to be more optimistic. So my question is really twofold. One, in a so-called democratically organized system of governance, how can it be the case, right, that those in power have the freedom to construct a system such that participation in the system is difficult or much harder than it should be? And then two, how ironic it is, or do you both find it ironic that in a democratic society that depends upon citizens being engaged politically, voting, that there doesn't seem to be much of an investment right, in educating and critically educating the American citizenry around issues like civics, for example, not to mention a host of other issues. So any thoughts you might have, Dr. Moraguez and Dr. Cooper, on this would be very very interesting, I think, to consider.
You're not asking easy questions there, but they're astute. And I will, at the outset, say I tend to be a cynic about American politics, also. But I try to see the silver lining on occasion. I certainly think there is an irony to the extent that we don't invest in civics education. Absolutely, I think it's incredibly problematic. And I think one of the things we don't teach people enough about in American politics is how the rules dictate the day. So these rules are procedures that don't necessarily have to be codified into law, although sometimes they are, how they're doing it. So if you think about the filibuster in the Senate, which I think is something that's really misunderstood, or people just aren't aware of the effect it has, or the agenda setting powers of the party leadership in Congress or the state legislature, that these are things that really, I mean, the power to block something from getting a vote is the biggest power that I think a lot of our politicians have. And I think that's really not well understood. It's something I don't think I thought about until I was in graduate school studying Congress, that this is the main way that power was wielded. And so I want to agree with Chris about how important that, like, teaching people about this, and definitely the state and local level as well, because that affects your everyday life more, is so critical to knowing what reforms to agitate for. You have to understand how the system works to some extent to know what changes need to be made to make the system more democratic. And to your question of, like, how politicians have the freedom to do this in a democratic system, I mean, like I said before, some of these are just rules they adopt, rules of the chamber that they can pass by simple majority. They're not technically a law, but then we get into things that are much more questionable. So if you think about gerrymandering, the fact that the Constitution says the states get to decide how their elections are run. And so that gives a lot of power to the state legislature to draw the districts that they get elected from, or that their colleagues get elected from. And so then, they kind of take advantage of some constitutional ambiguity to empower themselves and entrench themselves into power. And I think that's also something that we don't give enough attention to in our civics education in high school, middle school. These are things that we should start learning about earlier, because I think these are some of the least democratic practices, but we kind of just take them for fact when that need not be the case. But I'll let Chris weigh in if he'd like to.
No, I mean, I agree completely. And I think, I think we keep coming back to this point again. I think that Tracy Green Washington talked about changing structures leads to transformational change. And I think to change those structures, the first thing we have to do is understand what those structures are, right? And then start to understand how those structures incentivize people to do different things. And Mark, I think this kind of goes nicely to what you talked about, right? So this is politicians creating structures and then using that structure to entrench their power. And gerrymandering is a perfect example of how this occurs. I think if you look at, a rash of voting laws that are being brought up around the country right now. And they really are in response to who has power and how people believe, even though they're sometimes incorrectly, how changing the structure of who gets to vote how and how easy various types of voter access are might make themselves fare better or worse while they're in office. So yeah, I think they can get away with this because sometimes we don't understand these structures ourselves. And so, yeah, I think it is incumbent on us to improve civic education and then also to read and learn about these things ourselves and try to be a little bit less reactionary, try to think about the concept a little bit more than the person who's delivering that concept.
So, Chris, as I think about that, both you both brought up issues that I had written down: gerrymandering, and how can we reform some of these structures? And I wonder, Ashley, we put you in a category with Marcus over there, the cynic, and and I like to think, Chris, that maybe you and I are in the optimistic side. I can hear the optimistic language, so at least I have someone here on my side among my wonderful colleagues here. But I wonder, Chris, first I think about leadership too, right? How well do we do with truly developing leaders who know how to really lead, who are able to kind of set aside their own self-interest? I mean, this was the idea. This was the Republican idea, right? In Washington and Jefferson's time, that you set aside your own self-interest and you think about the greater good. Are you hopeful that we can actually get there? Is the leadership that is necessary to produce that type of leadership in the future? Do you see that is actually developing? And I hope that question is sensible.
Yeah, I think it's very sensible. I think it's very smart. And I'm sure Ashley has a lot to add to that too. I mean, yes, it's there. I'm not sure that our structures always get us there. So I'll just give you sort of one brief example. In North Carolina, if you want to run for the General Assembly, which is something I would encourage people to consider before they run for Congress, perhaps, it's an office that pays $13,951 a year. So who can afford to take a job for $13,951 a year that's in session sometime between January and maybe August, but it could go on to October or perhaps November? Not many people. People with money, for the most part, are the ones who can afford that. So I think thinking through, again, those structures that we have, we can change that though. I mean, the good news here is once you know that, we can change what these folks are getting paid. We can change what these structures are. We can work to recruit better candidates. There's a lot of groups that I'm encouraged by that are focusing in particular on the female pipeline into public office, realizing that at this point, the research kind of says, hey, it's on the candidate emergence side where we can make the most impact. And so there's some groups doing some really good work there. So I'm encouraged. I think there is a way to generate better leaders and to incentivize better people running for office. We don't always achieve it now, but I'll pass to Ashley.
All right. Well, thank you both for that. And Ashley, since you referenced Alexis de Tocqueville, I'm struck by the fact that many of the points that both of you are bringing up, he in some ways addressed in Democracy in America. So it's one reason why I'm such an advocate of people going back and reading that text, because I think it's so instructive as to where we are. So we want to really thank the both of you for those perspectives, and we're going to bring you back into the conversation in just a little while. But we want to transition, as we were thinking about leaders. What does the future hold? What is coming behind us? And we're so glad and honored to have two additional panelists here, two young panelists. Both are seniors at Asheville High School. Both are leaders in their community. We have Seth Bellamy, we have Miranda Williams with us, and we want to turn to them. And one of the questions that I would like to ask you all to consider as you begin to give us your perspective on civic engagement, what it looks like for your generation, I'd like to ask you too to kind of consider, what example are we giving you all? Are we giving you a good example today of what civic engagement looks like? Or do you all feel that you are having to kind of chart your own path here? And then I also think, Seth and Miranda, about, what legacy do you all want to leave? I mean, studies have shown that your generation is much more engaged than, let's say, maybe my generation or the generation right behind me, that you all are much more engaged in your communities and trying to change things. What accounts for that? But we're glad to have you here, glad that you all could join us. And it's so important, I believe, for us to hear these young voices. So Seth and Miranda, whichever one of you want to go first, we want to turn the floor over to you.
Hey, yes, thank you so much. My name is Miranda Williams. I am a senior at Asheville High School. And so to start off, I guess I'll briefly talk about what civic engagement is to me. So broadly, civic engagement is an individual or group addressing public, political, or societal issues. But civic engagement looks different to everyone and for everyone. Some people prefer to be on the front lines of change, and they want to take that role as an advocate and be the peacemaker like me. And some are simply trying to heal and re-educate themselves from biased teachings and generational trauma. You know, civic engagement, in my opinion, is a lifelong commitment. You know, you can't glance at the inequities and privilege in this land of the free and go back to life as normal. I feel like that is part of the reason why we are so deep in this systematic racism and oppression now, because we continue to acknowledge a problem without a solution. Do I feel that previous generations have led by examples? I definitely feel that growing up, I saw a mix of both. So like I had some really good influences that without a doubt motivated me to be where I am now, but also had some horrible influences that motivated me from like more of a negative perspective and made me feel like never again will you make me feel like this. You know, most of my positive role models aren't in textbooks and aren't people that you could look up on the internet. I mean, that's not to discredit Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, because these are essentials when you're talking about Black history. But the women or the people that I'm talking about now are these strong Black women from these lower income communities that are often overlooked, but are essential to the success and emotional, physical, and cultural development in these communities. You know, like from my personal experience, my best role model is my mother. You know, she instilled in me from a really young age that the one thing that no one can ever take from you is what you know. You know, she taught me in a nation of greed and money, and that, you know, that wasn't where the power resided. It resided in knowledge. And my mother, she doesn't have a college degree, but she taught me something that actual city schools couldn't. You know, I went through a period of time in elementary school. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the language gap, where I could read or I could spell, but I couldn't really read. And because, you know, being from where I was from, you know, teachers didn't really take that time out to help me get to where I needed to be. So she had to take on that role as mother, teacher, father. And that's where the real power resided for me. And that's what gave me the motivation to become who I am becoming now.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Miranda, for sharing that and sharing and being vulnerable. I also want to thank the panelists who came before me and who have set the path that we're on now, to actually even have this conversation about civic engagement and where we are today. And so one thing that has been a recurring theme throughout our conversation is, if you know better, you will do better. And we talked about education. We talked about us having the memory. And if you can't remember something, you don't know. And something that has been galvanizing toward me for how I'm involved in civic engagement in my local community, in my school community, and even in the places I interact with on a daily basis is that historical aspect. And so for many of us, we have first learned history from the eyes of our parents or from what they tell us or from what the school tells us. But civic engagement is taking a step forward and taking a step into the history that is more likely to be hidden, the history that is more likely to be in the back of the textbook, the history that is more likely to represent people of color who have been a constant part of what we consider the American dream, but have not had the light shine on them unless it's through strife. And so right now, in this time of civic engagement, Dr. Harvey and you brought up this idea of example that we are being set or setting ahead of us. And it has multiple variables to it. Are we looking at the setting, what has been set during the civil rights movement, and what Dr. Turner brought up about what he was involved in his version of Harlem in Kentucky? Or are we talking about the example that has been set on January 6th? And so there are multiple levels to what we want to look at and what we want to shine light on. And all of these are forms of civic engagement. And so as we move forward through this time, Miranda and I are kind of setting our own path, but also gleaning from the people before us and our predecessors. And so for many of us, we were first initially recognized and get engaged with A-Score and understanding who they were. And if you don't know, they were the Racial Equity Club at Stevens Lee High School. And they were the ones petitioning Woolworths to desegregate. And they were the ones who were first in our city of Asheville calling out the racism, both emboldened and hidden systemically here. And so that is how Miranda and I are able to move forward and actually be engaged in the way we want to be. And so now Miranda and I specifically are involved in REAP, which is Racial Equity Ambassadors Program, where we're actually teaching teachers about racial equity. And we're not only teaching, but we're also giving tools. And so education is a very good truism about how to move forward, but also how do people enact what they're learning. And I think that's a very important part that the people who are talking about politics before us, both of those doctors were bringing up about how are people able to use what they know about systems to change their structures. And right now we are having a lot of issues with changing those structures because of the lack of access. And so that's what it looks like for us to change sustainably. Who has access to change? Who has access to actually building a foundation for future generations to actually enact the change they want to see? And so Stacey Abrams, that was brought up by Ms. Washington, Ms. Washington brings up a good point about how she was able to get so many people registered to vote, which is just a simple form of access. And so I know from my experience, I did not have access initially once I started high school because I didn't know what to access. I didn't know what I wanted to change, but I knew I was proximate to certain issues. So I know I had to take a step out of what I learned in Civic. So what I initially learned at Schoolhouse Rock with the petition, but I actually had to move forward in how will I seek the change that I want to see within the place around me. So I had to go to school board meetings and actually speak up and say, this is what it actually looks like in an AP and honors classroom. I had to actually go to public health meetings and say, this is what happens when you send this certain messaging that villainizes us or villainizes people who use certain substances. But in actuality, there are major disparities in what is being seen and what is not. And so it's very important for us to understand what issues that we are proximate to and how can we change them in the most simplest and most robust ways. And so that's the legacy that I really want to leave moving forward is who has access and how it can change the historical narrative that only certain people are able to be in Congress. Only certain people are able to be both state and U.S. senators. I know for many of us, we were recognizing that only 11 Black U.S. senators have existed, and that was daunting. But for many of us, that was something that was just surreal and something that we know about everyday existence. And so as we move forward, it's very important for us to recognize the systems that we are coming from, but also where we want to move forward and how to change them civically.
Well, Seth, yeah, and I know, brother, you have a question. I'm going to let you jump in here, but I want to say one thing. I want to make one observation here. So now, if you're walking away from this pessimistic, brother, I don't know what to do. So, because this, just listening to both Miranda and Seth, that it leaves me very hopeful. And so I, just really proud to hear what you all had to say. But brother, I had to take another dig, So
no, hey, that was a good one. That was a good one. No, but Miranda and Steph, thanks so much for your thoughtful comments and for the work that you were doing already at the high school level. It really is energizing to me. And as Dr. Waters just said, it does really challenge my pessimism about America's political future. But I'm really struck, Seth, by your point about concerning the work that you're doing to teach teachers, right? So teaching teachers about racial equity and structural change and issues surrounding those two topics. So I'm curious to hear more from both of you about what your experience has been as students, right, whose activism includes sort of subversively educating teachers about these issues. Have teachers been receptive to this? Have you experienced pushback? What has the dynamic been like, Seth and Miranda?
Yes, so definitely. So the racial equity ambassadors, this is the first year it's ever been implemented in Asheville High School in Silsa. And yes, unfortunately, there has been some pushback, but on the very first time we presented, we expected it because before this program was implemented in Asheville High School, me as an African American female can honestly tell you that I could feel the biases and I could feel, like the stereotypes and the racism that was hidden, but there, you know what I mean? And some of it was on accident. Students segregate themselves unintentionally, but some of it, especially coming from like the adults, was intentional. And like as I go through some of this feedback that we do get from the teachers, it really is an eye opener. Like it really makes me think, like I know you could hold these biases in the classroom in person, but while everything is still, while everything's virtual, I can see, when school let out, it gave us a chance to reimagine what education looked like. And instead of you guys taking that time to do that and come together and say they deserve better as students, we deserve better as a school and as an education system, we're stuck in the cycle. So, but I guess the good thing that I would say, like overall, is that every time I go and look at the feedback, the good outweighs the bad, but there is some bad and there is some pushback.
Absolutely. Thank you, Miranda, for bringing up that balance. And so I do want to bring up the moniker again, if you know better, you can do better. And so for many of the people involved in systems, teachers, principals, administrations, or anyone involved in any major system, you know that you are steeped into this historical nature of how you even got to this place. How is this system even existing in this moment? And so sometimes you're enacting the system without even knowing it. And so if you tell a fish that they're in the ocean, but all they see is what they know, it kind of challenges them because they've just been swimming along in this water. And so as we go and develop within racial equities ambassadors, and we're calling out what is racism or what is something that is systemically harmful, it will always be pushback. There will always be some feelings of animosity within there, but there's also feelings of growth. And I think that is the overwhelming feeling I've got working with teachers and working with administrators, is that they want to know how we can better build that bridge between students and teachers, between adults and youth within this system of education. And so one of our predecessors brought up, politics is for power, so is education. And so as we move forward, that foundation that we're building with Racial Equity Ambassadors Program is building a foundation of racial equity education to build tools for more sustainable and equitable practice for educating our youth today.
Seth, I'm hearing from you and Miranda from you as well, that you are able, because sometimes we let me say this first, we get, it seems to me that we can get hung up on wanting to see big changes, right? We want to see very big changes quickly, but it sounds to me from the perspective that you're offering here, that you're able to see incremental change, and you still, that incremental change is able to kind of sustain you in continuing the work. Is that a good way to read what both of you are saying?
Definitely. Like when I first started this journey for social justice and social change, I knew it wasn't an overnight process. And like over the years, I guess experience has helped me to learn that you have to celebrate the little victories or you'll be sad forever. And like I said earlier, like I've acknowledged that this is a lifelong process, that in my lifetime I may not have reached and being able to see the change that I like to see in this nation, but doing all that I can while I'm here and celebrating the little victories that I'm collecting along the way is what matters.
And Seth, I really, Miranda, what you just said, I really appreciate that. And Seth, I saw you shaking your head. Yes, that you're able to find, encouragement from these incremental changes. There's a book, and Miranda, it makes me think of a book that someone had suggested I read it, and I did read it by the author's name is Adam Gopnik, and it's called A Thousand Small Sanities. And for those of you who are joining this conversation in the audience, if you haven't read that book, I would encourage you to read it, because it talks about how, you know, the American frame and system of government has allowed for this activity to push the ball, to push the needle. And sometimes it doesn't come quickly, as Dr. Turner can attest to, and so many others, but at least we're seeing this incremental change. And I'm glad to hear that for you all, that is encouraging to keep you all kind of in the fight. Miranda, I also think it's important to kind of emphasize what you said about it's not always the big name people who have changed so much. It's some of the people on the ground. And I think of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who Dr. Turner brought up, and I think that Tracy Green Washington brought up as well. And you think about Ella Baker and those stories. And there are many people who have done so many important things on the ground. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about the work that has been done in these individual communities. And I would love to be able, as a historian, pick your brains about your ideas about what we can do to be better at telling those stories. So thank you all for giving your perspective here. And I think that what we want to do now, Marcus, is bring everybody back. And we want to go into a bit of a Q&A to allow the audience to kind of raise some questions that they may have. And I think that some of the folks at Blue Ridge Public Radio, Lily is going to help us with that, to tell us what people have been saying out there. And so just welcome everybody back together here. And I'm hoping that what we can do in this period too is kind of be in conversation with each other. It's been great to hear how, Seth, you and Miranda have referenced what Tracy said, what Dr. Turner said, what Dr. Cooper and Ashley, everybody has had to say. So I would love to have us all in conversation with each other. But Lily, let me ask you, what are we hearing out there?
Well, thanks, everybody. There are a lot of great questions coming in. Everybody is really enjoying what you guys are talking about. One of the first questions that I kind of wanted to start with comes from Marie Cochran. She is a local artist, activist. I don't know if you guys know Marie, but she has a question about accountability. And I think, you know, that's sort of a thread throughout what all of you were talking about. And she wants to know if there are any options for accountability in a lot of these issues that we're talking about beyond the ballot box. And I would love to throw this to Dr. Turner and kind of let him start with that.
You're muted, Bill.
If I understand the question, maybe it should be rephrased, or somebody else can pick up on it. In terms of accountability, Lily, is that what you said now?
Yeah, Marie was just asking, you know, we're talking about politics and all of these changes that we want to make on a political level. How do we keep people accountable for making these changes, whether they're elected to office or otherwise, beyond just voting? What else can people do to keep people accountable?
Okay, well, I think one of the things that people can do is to, particularly if they are elected, there's that basic way that you can always get them back out of office, if you will, by voting them out. But at the same time, I think since there's so much attention drawn to the various social media that our younger people rely on so heavily, they can call these people out in various ways on, platforms such as Twitter and like that. I'll defer to somebody else, but I do want to say before I stop what I'm saying here now, in terms of that accountability question, I'm so pleased, Miranda and Seth, to hear a 17-year-old talk about her lifetime. That's just fantastic. And I just thank you so much. And it's just hard to believe that you can be in the same room, so to speak, with somebody who's 17 and you are the age, you're younger than my grandchildren. But the idea about it too is that there are a lot of things that I thought my grandchildren would never have to see. But unfortunately, they have come at a time when some things are much worse than they were when I was 17. Although there are a lot of things much better than they were 60 years ago. But the point of it is what you guys are facing. And I salute you for what you and Seth have said. And you're in good company with Darren and Marcus there. So somebody else may have a thought about accountability, and I'll defer to you.
I have a couple of
Yes.
thoughts, and I appreciate what Dr. Turner said, and love that Seth and Miranda are here. And I was just taking notes and really just basking in your firmness about and your clarity. And so thank you for that. As I think about the question about accountability, I think about it in two ways. One, about accountability on the front end of the process of us really working to identify a robust candidate base that is multi-generational, that is moving into these spaces, and they have and are using a racial equity lens, and understand who they are accountable to, and are willing and understand that the community will hold them accountable if they don't keep their promises, and be able to move structural change and systemic issues forward, right? And I think on the other end, around accountability for individuals that are already in office, I love that Seth talked about this notion of invisibility, right? Because so much of this work is about making things visible. And particularly when we're talking about systemic issues, when we're talking about structural change, the system is designed for us not to see it, right? The system is working exactly the way it's supposed to. And so I think in terms of accountability, if we can actually help individuals that we put in political office, that we put in leadership positions to see better, I think that is an important part of accountability. And the work that I do, I often say, I have a saying in terms of when I'm supporting partners, and I say, if you can see it, then you can name it. And if you can name it, you can interrupt it and reimagine it. And so I think part of that accountability is helping people see it so it doesn't become so normalized, right? And with them seeing it, know that they have a responsibility to do something about it, to act in a different way, to hold this lens in every action, every relationship, and every position that they are in. And if they are holding it, then their language around accountability begins to shift. You're asking who's advantaged and disadvantaged as a result of us making this decision or having this conversation or creating this collaboration, right? What are the inequities that would I be moving forward? In my role, if I don't act, would I be able to, will I actually be exacerbating these issues or keeping them in place? And so I think if we can help hold accountability in those multiple ways, and I'm sure there are others that other individuals and my colleagues will share on the call, but it definitely seems to me that it's a both and. It's like at the beginning of it, let's get the right people in there, right? And then for those that are in there, let's help them see better so that they can make different decisions about how we can all do this work so it is impactful.
Tracy, I really appreciate that. And I want to give both Ashley and Chris and anybody else who wants to jump in on that question an opportunity to contribute here. Because Chris and Ashley, I'm sure that you have a perspective on this issue of accountability. But there's a thread that I hear through here. And Marcus, I don't know if you're hearing this as well, brother, but I'm hearing people, we have a panel here, a group that have a deep historical consciousness. And one of the things that you and I have talked about that we find very problematic about American society, and here again, I will go to Alexis de Tocqueville because he said this was one of the problems with America, that there wasn't this deep historical consciousness that we had, that we as Americans really think about the present moment. We don't think so much about history, and we're so kind of in a mode of being so anxious about the present moment that we give very little thought to the future. And I'm hoping, and Chris and Ashley, as I look at Alexis de Tocqueville and what he was saying in 1835 when he was writing this, I like to think that maybe he was hopeful that as the country got older, it would change. Is that changing? Is there something that we need to do to try to deepen the historical consciousness of this country in the way that I feel the members of this panel have that historical consciousness? Does that, again, Chris and Ashley, I hope that it's a sensible question that I'm asking.
I'll take a stab at it first, and then Chris, you can go for it after me. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think Tracy made a lot of points. And I do fear, at least when we're talking about elected office, that there isn't a ton of historical memory, and I think that politicians take advantage of that. And so what we find is that political time is very fast, and politicians are very strategic about when they're accountable to their constituents. So right before an election, like an election year, they do all this stuff to pander to their base and to make sure that it looks like they're responding to the needs of their constituents. But when, right after they're elected, they have a lot more freedom because they don't think that, their constituents are going to be paying attention until right up to the next election. So they take advantage of the fact that we're not putting consistent pressure or not paying attention to these. And so I think there is that historical context that we need to put in mind there, not only like long history, but also the shorter history of a single, congressional term, a senatorial term. I think is really important to consider. And then a question I just want to pose is accountability to who? I mean, I think we have a huge problem in politics where we have these politicians who are serving multiple constituencies. Only one of them is actually the voters who put them into office or the people living in their districts. And, having money in politics creates other potential agents for them to be responding to or principles for them to be responding to. And so I think that we kind of get into a messiness about how to keep politicians accountable to us, the people living in their districts and their voters, that I think, they're responding to some people always. It's just not necessarily the right group of people. But I'm sure Chris has some thoughts on this as well.
No, I agree with all of that completely. I think to Marie's question too, what I would encourage people to think through sort of using agenda setting, right? So I think Ashley before talked about how a lot of the power in politics is about setting agendas and not so much fighting them on something where they're already dug in, but reminding them of which issues are important, right? So if a lot of politics is not, you're not going to move somebody off a position that they have stated publicly, but can you get them to take on your issue? Yeah, I think your odds of success are a lot greater there. So I think that is one way to influence politics and to hold people accountable. I would say sometimes this conversation will move into a discussion of term limits. So I'll just pop in here real quick and say that political scientists we're united on very little, but this one we are united on. Term limits is not the solution to this. And the reason is sort of twofold. One, when we term limit people out of office, what do? They become lobbyists. So they move from, we have this one, we can actually affect them a little bit at the ballot box. Once they become lobbyists, they then have the power and we can't affect them at all. It also means that we're getting more and more junior people in office who just don't know as much. And so who do they go to again when they don't know as much? They go to lobbyists. So term limits are a really good way to increase the influence of lobbyists, which I have a feeling none of us are really after that is the primary goal.
And I would just add this quickly. I mean, thank you all for your comments. But I think one of the, and I'm thinking sort of more broadly in a broader historical view here. I'm sure my brother Darren would appreciate this, but I think one of the main difficulties in approaching this question of accountability is that the country has really developed a kind of a culture, I guess, a culture of avoiding accountability for what the country's history has wrought in the present, especially around issues like race, inequity, etc. And so I think, even the sort of the more local conversations about accountability among politicians has to be tethered to this broader conversation about how the country has struggled for decades now, if not longer, to really hold itself accountable for what its own history has created in the present. So I would just add that.
Very good point. And I don't know, Miranda and Seth, do you all want to jump in on this question? If not, we can, I know we've only been on one question, Lily, here, and there are a number of others. So do we want to jump to the next question? I'll let you take the lead there, Lily.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think all of the questions are so connected just because this whole conversation is so connected. And one of the things that came up in answering that question and throughout the night was also just how do people how can you rebuild trust in these communities, whether it's between politicians or between our community. You know, Dr. Cooper made his joke about politicians and cockroaches and their similar popularity ratings. And we actually got a question from Kirk Brown, who says, you know, given the growing sense of fault lines in society and the very isolation of this pandemic, how do we build the bridges that will lead to a healthier civic engagement?
Yeah.
So how do we rebuild that trust?
Right. I thank Kirk for that question. Kirk is a really good friend. And Kirk, I just want to say before I turn this over, and one of the people I want to go to for a response to this question is Tracy. And Kirk, I want to say you did see that I was not the first one to bring up Alexis de Tocqueville tonight. So, you know, so Kirk, I just wanted to say that. But Tracy, I think that you may have a response to this question that Kirk is raising, because one of the things that I think was important, and Bill, you addressed this as well in talking about how the civil rights movement, like SNCC, how it actually operated. And Marcus, brother, we were talking about this last night. You know, how Black communities had to function more as a community in the era of segregation than you see it today. But Tracy, I think that the model that you're using with CoThink is really a model to address this issue of trust, building trust among different groups of people. So I would love to hear your response to Kirk's question.
Thank you, Dan. I think it's a meaty conversation and a meaty issue. I think when I think about the CoThink model, at the center of it requires us to trust each other, right? In order to be able to give money, to be able to have these hard conversations around really hard issues in our community, we have to create an environment where individuals understand that we care about them, number one, right? We need their voice in the room, and we need them to show up as their best self doing their work. And we're not going to villainize you for being in this learning journey. We want you to be engaged, to be able to have the hard conversation. And I think the thing that came to mind as the question was being raised is the word around reconciliation. Oftentimes we are afraid to have this conversation about reconciliation and resetting our relationships. Oftentimes when harm has occurred, we really want to push it up under the rug, when in fact, in that moment, it's a great opportunity to acknowledge the harm that's happened. When acknowledging the harm that's happening and how you're going to move forward differently, and what is your commitment to that, right? And responsibility. Now that's a different type of relationship that I can engage with you in. But if you never acknowledge the harm, right? The role that you played, the complicity around it, how can you reset a relationship that is not able to be real about where you start resetting from? And so as I think about that and think about the work with CoThink, that's why we anchor our work in healing. Healing work is so critical to this work. We have to heal. We have to help others heal. We have to help everyone understand their role, forgive themselves, and to move forward. But be very specific and explicit, right? That as a result of you knowing better, and like Seth said, you do better, right? You can't say, hey, I made a mistake again, I have a boo-boo. No, this is the moment that you have to show up and say, I made a mistake. I understand why. I have an analysis around why that was wrong. I'm willing and understand that my role in being the ally in this work is X. And this is the action that I'm prepared to do and move forward and will be accountable to relative to the work. That's why I love Barbara Love's work around transformational and structural change. She talks about this notion of moving from this place of awareness when something is wrong, this noticing, right? To having this deep analysis of understanding why it's important that I notice and what is its implication to this work and my role. And then it moves you into this place of you having to be explicit about how are you an ally, what action you're prepared to take, and what does that mean around accountability. That is the same thing when we think about healing. That's the same thing when we think about repair, reconciliation. We have to do that work in a cyclical way. And one of the things I love with CoThink is that we're always doing that work. I think about the latest conversation that we're having relative to identity and the pain that's coming up with that and the conversations that we're having. We have to be willing to have the conversation, to be uncomfortable, and to make restitution to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Tracy. And I'm thinking also, I'm thinking about the question you mentioned, reconciliation and the need to have hard conversations. And I'm curious to hear from others, Dr. Turner. Why do you think it's so hard to incentivize people to want to participate in these conversations, these hard, ugly, messy, difficult, painful conversations around reconciliation? Why? So I'm curious to hear from you, Bill, given your broader historical experience, having been involved in the civil rights movement, comparing that to what you see now. Uh, why are these conversations so difficult to stage?
Well, I think they're difficult because it's a fundamental flaw in the human system is to admit you've made a mistake. You know, people do not like to look in the mirror. And I'll just say this very quickly. Eddie Glaude at Princeton has a new book out you may have seen. It's called Begin Again. And Charles Blow, who writes for the New York Times, has a new book called The Devil You Know. And they have taken some very new ways of looking at that very question of reconciliation in the same manner that Bishop Tutu headed up such a commission, you know, just after apartheid. So that the original big lie, you know, the original way that the American dilemma has never been faced up, going all the way back to the very basis when we talk about reparations. That is where people don't want to go. And I think going forward, we know that part of the issue for Miranda and Seth's generation is there are a lot of people in our country who are extremely anxious about the demographic shift that is unfolding, so that by the time these 17-year-olds are 35, the people who now comprise the majority will not be the majority anymore. So that you can see the politics out for the next 25 years. And I think people are having problems coming to grips with that because it amounts to the kind of melting of the glacier in terms of white supremacy, in terms of white hegemony, and the politics have been racialized all along in this country. And to the same extent that when I was a young person and going over my lifetime, having covered, you know, absolute segregation to desegregation, and even the kind of disintegration of certain things that served us well in the Black community, those things being gone, I think that it's just a space that everybody knows. I'm sorry, nobody really knows where this is going, but we do know that we're all in the midst of some monumental changes. And it's, I think someone said it best, that nobody really likes change except a baby with a dirty diaper.
Good way to put it, Bill. And we are just about to reach our time together. The time goes so fast. Marcus and I find that happens all the time. I want to take a moment here before Lily kind of poses the last question to us here that we can take. Marcus and I are going to find a way to engage some of these other questions that have come in. And we want to tell the people who actually sent us emails giving us their perspectives on civic engagement. And Marcus and I really want to take the time to respond to those as well. You know, I have one sitting here right in front of me, Mark Peters. He wrote in and I think he made the point, there's something that emerges from his email. He talked about the need to have a sense of purpose. And Marcus, that made me think about the questions that we have been asking, the framing questions in the most recent shows that we've been doing about who are we and who do we want to be? Does America, does our society, is it is it structured in a way that it gives people a sense of purpose? And that's a question for Miranda and Seth. And what we're going to do, Miranda and Seth, is ask you guys to come back on just a show with Marcus and I at some point, just to talk about those issues, to get your perspective. But Lily, I'm going to turn it over. I just wanted to throw that thought out there because I thought that was an interesting point that Mark made in his email about having this sense of purpose. But Lily, go ahead and give us the last question, and then we will wrap up.
Well, great. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to want to tune in for that show because everybody wants to hear more from Seth and Miranda. We want to know how people want to know how to support your organization. And I know we get a lot of questions at BPR about, how adults can be civically engaged and what we can do, people who aren't your teachers and aren't a part of your program. What kind of advice do you guys have for adults that you wish people older than you were doing? And yeah, let us know how to support your organization.
Absolutely. So I'll go ahead and put the plug in initially. So you can go ahead and follow Keeping It Real, which is the first racial equity club at our school, by the Instagram handle Keepin, which is KEEPIN _it real, which is IT, and then real R.E.A.L. And you can go ahead and follow us and support us throughout this month and beyond. And so one of the things I want to pose to the adults and to the people who are listening is, how can you leverage your position to change the structure you are benefiting from? And so often we look at what is happening around us, and a great point was brought up. Why is it hard to have these conversations? And who are we putting the position on to even to begin these conversations or conceive them? And usually it's the people who have been harmed the most. And so that is why it's very hard for us to have these conversations, because you're continually putting the people who are on the front lines on a continuous basis in those positions to start and revitalize these conversations that are causing them more harm. And so I implore people, especially people who have a sense of privilege and a certain identity, or are in a privilege within their organization, to begin conversations without having to center the people who are most at risk of being harmed. And so that can be very hard to do, especially if you are risking something or are nervous about the backlash of your peers. But to be civically engaged, you have to be audacious. You have to be bold. You have to put yourself in a position to change the world and to change the system that you are benefiting from. And so oftentimes we bring up this idea of, you can still be performative, but how are you actually going to change it tomorrow? And so you can put on the kente cloth to change this policy, or you can post about Black history every February, but how are you going to change it? Are you going to keep putting that landfill near the Black community? Are you going to still give students a small budget for actually getting fed in school, or getting those benefits? Are you going to continue enacting policy that maintains this inequitable system we're in? And so we have to put ourselves and hold ourselves accountable to actually change what we're benefiting from. And that's the change I want to see from the adults who are listening to this conversation.
Well, thank you, Seth. And for that perspective, Miranda, do you want one final word here?
Yes, really briefly. That was great. And pretty much echoing that, like, from the adults, I feel like the best thing that you can do right now is to, as we talked about accountability, take accountability. Some of your peers are the ones that are making our jobs a lot harder. It takes nothing to be like, hey, that's not cool. Why are you feeling like this? Like, as we are doing the Racial Equity Ambassadors program, one thing that came up was that, like, in these honors and college courses, I've never had a teacher acknowledge that I was the only African American in their class. And a teacher said, he was like, well, if we were to, what would that look like? And I would be like, just acknowledging that I was there, because the one thing that I do understand is that the reason why I'm the only one is beyond you. It's beyond me. This is cause and effect for things that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But accountability is the beginning of change. And as Seth mentioned, that when we do talk about having these hard discussions in those classrooms, we are the ones that are uncomfortable, because what I've learned, at least at Asheville High School, is that our peers in those classrooms, if they bond over nothing, they can bond over the fact that their whiteness. And we, being the only one, there is no comfort in that. You have comfort of your peers when you're the only one. you are the one uncomfortable, and it's like you aren't the one that really needs to change in the situation. So definitely keeping that in mind and knowing that the power and the leverage that you have with your peers and your associates is of the utmost importance. The kids are ready to make the change.
All right. Well, thank you, Miranda. Marcus, Ashley, and Chris. We as professors who are in the classroom, are we all going to try to get these two at our respective institutions? So thank you all for being here. Marcus, if you want a final word here as well, one thing we want to thank our panelists, our friends for joining us tonight on this live version of the Waters and Harvey Show. This has been a project that Marcus and I deeply enjoy, and it's just been great to be in conversation with so many different people. And Marcus, I will say, I learned so much from the guest, just like I've learned so much from you. It's like you have sharpened my mind and my thinking on so many different things. So I deeply value all of the perspectives that we've had here tonight. So thank you all for being here. Marcus, I'll let you jump in here as well.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything that you just said, brother. Thank you to all the panelists who participated tonight. I've learned a great deal from this conversation, and I look forward to thinking more about what you all have shared. I would just say quickly as we wrap up here that I think that what this part of what this conversation amounts to is really a collective call to accountability, right? So accountability doesn't just reside in one social sphere or one social domain, but rather it's something that we all share in, whether we like it or not. So I think the health of the country's future really depends upon our collective willingness to share accountability.
Right. And we want to thank you all for being in the audience as well and for joining this conversation tonight. And Marcus and I would say too, I think a new episode of the Waters and Harvey Show will air tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock on Blue Ridge Public Radio. And we're going to be talking about the COVID crisis in the African American community. We had the opportunity to do an interview with Dr. Rochelle Brandon, and it is a lively conversation that you will get a chance if you tune into the show tomorrow to hear that. But providing you with trusted and accurate information and engaging our community in leading it in thought-provoking conversations are Blue Ridge Public Radio's top priorities. This public service relies on your support. You can help sustain it, for yourself and for your neighbors with a donation to Blue Ridge Public Radio. And that you can make that at bpr.org. And we want to thank you again so much for joining us this evening. And Marcus and I both would say you can keep the conversation going in the comment section on the video, and you can always share your feedback with us with an email to whshow@bpr.org. We may use your comments and thoughts in future shows that we do, and I'm sure we really will be talking about some of the comments that have come in, because I think, Marcus, it will enliven the conversation even more. But once again, I just want to personally thank everybody for being here tonight. Thank you for this opportunity. Marcus, it's been fun. It didn't turn out bad at all, did it? We were nervous about it going in, but it has been